If I get
Okay.
kicked off or Carol gets kicked off, hang tight and we'll try. And hopefully it won't be too pernicious. Yeah, all right. So it's 11:05, the start for the day, and
Okay.
our guest is Carol.
Zach. I'm delighted to be back with you again. And Zach, if you want to start the screen share, we'll get going. Today, we're going to talk about 6 photographers who focus on social justice. And I will be thrilled as can be if any of these are new to you. There may be some that are new. There may be some familiar names and familiar images as well. And we're going to hope to get, oh, here we go. It wasn't that long after photography was invented. Photography is invented in 1839. Call it a magic pencil or a pencil of nature. That idea that it can miraculously capture something like the intricacies of a fern or a landscape, that's really the first thing that captures photographers' imagination. But it isn't very long until photographers begin to force for change. I'm going to ask Zach for the next image, please. Okay. Going to get the next. There we go. All right. This is apparently the first image ever recorded as a photograph of slaves in the United States.
Wow.
Lewis Hine,
No,
who's
not a protest. I don't
nope.
think. Oh yeah, it looks like it is.
No, they're
No,
not.
these
They're
are
carried.
slaves carrying. And first image ever recorded of a plantation in the United States. Lewis Hine, he said, my photography exists to show things that need to be appreciated and this is the key, show things that need to be changed. Charles Moore, whose work we're going to look at in a second, who documented the civil rights movement. With my fists, I want to fight with my camera.
Wow.
And that's a very powerful idea, and one that Gordon Parks in his book called Choice of Weapons uses that too, is that the camera is a camera be my weapon than my fists any day. And I thought, what a power. Of them are new to you. And Reese actually was an if you can get that one, Zach, the next image. Zach is trying to find, I think, better internet in his house. Reese is a really interesting character. Was not what we would say an art form today.
Oh.
Okay, we're getting there. Zach is searching for better internet. And what he really wanted to do, his only real goal was to show that what he was writing about was true. Okay, so that's why he took the photographs. So this is a photograph called Bandit's Roost. So while working as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, he did a series. Clearly, he realized that the written accounts, although they were horrifying, did not get people's attention as a photograph would. So he added this, and of course, everything changed. Okay, we're going to keep on that next We've gone back. We just need to go to the next. We're going to stay right there. Gonna stay right there. Whoa, whoa, no, we're not going forward. We're going to go back. Great. We're going to stay right there. So he goes absolutely everywhere with what were called the sanitary police as a reporter. So he went to crowded tenements and dock sides and cheap lodging houses and sweatshops and what were called beer dives, which were in cellars. Part of this went into a book called How the Other Half Lives. And he had to work very, very quickly and get in and out of what were clearly dangerous situations. This piece again is called Bandit's Roost. And this was a nickname for an alley near Mulberry Street in New York City. And if you look at the photograph, and I didn't really even tell you about his background, I think you would say it was rather technically crude, kind of blurred, overexposed, and a peculiar perspective, and not necessarily a balanced composition. But in a sense, none of that really
I think it's
matters.
beautiful.
What this photo gives you is what one writer called the power of witness. This idea that here we are in this alley in New York, and there's something that is so powerful about what we're seeing that if we don't really worry about it in a way we would have about a traditional photograph. Next image, please. But again, for him, remember, this is evidence and not necessarily all about the photograph. This is a lodging spot. This is called 5 cents a spot. And it captures, again, this room and the adjoining room here housed. And again, you were paying for a night's lodging in this room, 15 men and women and a baby.
Oh,
This is the kind of thing, again, that the sanitary police would have discovered and he would have documented. Next image, please. This gives you a sense too of some of the labor that was, oh, no, we're gonna go back. We skipped one there. There we go. There we go. These are the lodgers in Bayard Street. And again, you get a sense here of entire families working in their lodging, very little air or light, often working 12 hours or more a day, 6 days a week. And these are, if you can see from the wooden form that the man is seated next to, cigar makers here who are rolling 4,000 cigars a week, for which they're paid $15 and the rent was $12.
Wow.
And again, what he captures here hadn't really been seen before in photos, which is, again, an interesting idea. What he captures is really that chaos of living. And that's what, again, we get through Jacob Riis's lens. Next image, please. Louis Hine was a continuation, and we see Hine here with his camera of Riis's work. Hine does, though, think about formal components in. He's very, very much ahead of his time. As a young reformer and a teacher, he early on taught at the New York Ethical Culture School, a very progressive association. And as early as 1901, sent his students out armed with cameras, which again is something we do today, but what an extraordinary thing that that was being done in 1901. He said his goal was for students to see better, to see better. One of his first large-scale projects, and we're going to go to the next image, please, was about Ellis Island. At that time, of course, when many cartoonists are depicting immigrants with these horrific and cruel stereotypes, and immigration was politically charged, he depicted immigrants with such dignity and sympathy in his work. And imagine what it would have been like to persuade people, many of whom were not speaking English, with his odd camera and his kind of magnesium flash powder to allow him to take their photograph. An extraordinary body of work of these new immigrants. Next image, please, coming through Ellis Island. And there's an exhausted woman, again, on her suitcase, asleep. So that was, again, probably one of the things he's most well known for. Some of his, excuse me, most famous work, though, we're going to go to the next image, please, was actually commissioned by the National Child Labor Committee. And these are fascinating. And these, I bet many of you have seen. In these images, what Lewis Hine does is infiltrate mills and factories and mines. And he has said and written that he used every trick in the book. And again, don't think you could get away with this today, but fascinatingly, in the early part of the 20th century, he would do things like pose as an insurance agent, saying, I just need to check the mill, check the equipment. He posed as a postcard seller. He posed too as a Bible salesman and as an industrial photographer, saying, I need to take photographs of the equipment. So he used all these different ruses to actually then get into the factories and capture the reality of kids, 7, 8, 9, 10, working 12-hour days, 6 days a week in dangerous conditions, again, without what we would call today protective equipment of any kind. Many of them, again, victims of industrial accidents and injuries too. And this is a girl in a Carolina textile mill tending to this huge machine. And again, they're just extraordinary documents. Next image, please. The next one is Midnight in a Glass Works. And again, young kids, probably 10, 11, 12 years old. Again, there's no protective gloves. There's no protective eyewear. Again, doing this very, very dangerous work. Next image, he captures some of the most horrifying are what were called the breaker boys. And these are young boys, usually in the range of 8 to 12 years old. But sometimes by greasing the right palms, a child as young as 5 or 6 could work in mines as well. And these breaker boys, what they did was to sit by coal chutes and they would pull out the impurities. So they would, a chute of coal would come by and you would have to grab out the slate pieces, which of course would be very, very sharp. You're doing this with, again, often bare hands, although I noticed some gloves here. You're breathing in coal dust. And again, usually 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And these kind of tough, interesting faces that look far, far older than their years. Next image, please. Okay, and this is actually a 5-year-old who was a shrimp picker. And again, just incredible image of someone who is in many ways older than 5 and doing dangerous and difficult work 6 days a week. I think what Hine found is the same thing that Reese saw, is that charts and graphs and tables just don't move the public as a photograph does and did in the past too. And certainly legislation was enacted as a result of seeing the photographs of Lewis Hine. Next image, please. The next photographer is Marion Post Walcott, and she probably is not very well known to you. She's not nearly as well known as her contemporary Margaret Bourke-White. Marion Post Walcott was working at the same time, but Margaret Bourke-White worked pretty continuously for over 30 years. And although she was married and divorced, did not have a family, where Marion Post Walcott stopped out to have a family, and her greatest body of work occurred before that. She too has the kind of passion and heart of a reformer and social research, a progressive. She was a freelancer for Life magazine, for Fortune, and also a staff photographer for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. She also worked, as did many significant photographers, for Roy Stryker at the Farm Security Administration during the Depression, 38 to 42. Next image, please. What she does is fascinating. And this is, again, one of her photographs, very, very powerful, but just so simple and stark too. Just the one solitary figure, African-American man going up that exterior staircase outside of a movie theater to the segregated entrance. What she does is during the late 30s and early 40s, travels by herself thousands of miles. She travels across the United States taking photographs. She stops at farms and juke joints and bars and schools and theaters and stores and captures exactly what you see in a way that is just, I think, has a different feel from some of her contemporaries. Next image, please. This is I think she really establishes this is again, a woman on a porch, kind of leaning off that porch. You can see very, very thin farm wife. There is something that she captures where I feel like there's a kind of a connection, a relationship that she establishes with her sitters as she travels and captures the country during the heights of the Depression. Next image, please. And again, kids coming from a cabin, and again, that she captures the horrors here of childhood malnutrition and of rickets with these children. I think there's something about the post-Walcott that, for me, again, maybe because we don't see these as frequently as we see the works of somebody like Margaret Bourke-White, that to me these seem kind of new and fresh in a way because we don't see them as often. But I think she and her work is little known and should be better known. And again, captures extraordinary images of the late 30s and the early 40s all across this country. Next image, please. Now, Gordon Parks, I don't know if he is an artist that many of you know, originally from Fort Scott, Kansas, as Gordon Parks later said, the Mecca of bigotry. Gordon Parks is probably one of the most versatile artists, I think, of the 20th century. There was nothing Parks didn't try, and I don't think there were very many areas in which he didn't find success. He was not just a photographer, and in his photography, he was taking portraits and news images and big photo essays and fashion images as well. But not just a photographer, he was also a writer. He wrote poetry, and he wrote a series of amazing memoirs. One you may have heard of called The Learning Tree, another one called Choice of Weapons. He was a musical composer as well, and a filmmaker. Actually the first African-American to direct a Hollywood film, the original Shaft. And he was a collaborator. He worked with and was friends with the writer Ralph Ellison. So if you don't know him, boy, you've got to read him. He was the first Black photographer to work for Life magazine. Also the first African-American to work for the Farm Security Administration. So he's just, again, so if you don't know him, you need to explore the life of Gordon Parks. He's one of 15 kids. Wow. And was out on his own very, very early in life. And as he said, he did everything from a busboy to a railroad porter to a CCC tree planter to a brothel piano player before discovering photography. Purchased his first camera at age 25, and again, was largely, please. And this is, again, one of his most famous images. Parks said, when I felt I couldn't say what was in me, I turned to photography. I learned it would enable me to show what was right and what was wrong about America, the world, and life. In 1941, he received a fellowship where I just mentioned Roy Stryker was the the driving force behind this project. And he said, Stryker took my camera away and said, why don't you go out and get to know Washington, D.C.? So he said, I went then to the motion pictures. And again, remember, this is 1941 in Washington, D.C. I went to the motion pictures and was refused entrance. He said, I went to a big department store and the clerk wouldn't sell me a coat. They wouldn't feed me at several restaurants. He said, I was furious. Went back, of course, to talk to Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker said, well, why don't you photograph that? And why don't you get to know this charwoman, this African-American charwoman who we see here, who worked in the same building that they did. This is Ella Watson. So he follows Ella Watson for weeks, home, church, work, where she was struggling to support her daughter and grandchildren on a government building in Washington, D.C. At one point in their kind of experience together, he posed her in this pose in front of the flag with the tools of her trade, completely and intentionally echoing Grant Wood's American Gothic, which everybody would have been familiar with. Stryker saw, knew, as he said to Parks, you're going to get us all fired. But really, really fascinating piece, and just incredible work. Next image, please. This is more of Ella Watson, again, in her apartment with her family. And out and get a photo. Because of the Farm Security Administration, later, as a result of his work with life, he was able to delve very deeply into a subject and spend weeks with somebody and capture them in all the different aspects of their life, which is something I just don't think we have anything equivalent of this today. Again, many of his projects for life were 16-page photo essays that allowed him to get to know somebody and allowed a new way. Next image, please. One of the most famous pieces for Life magazine was here in 1968, simply called A Harlem Family, and he followed this family, the Fontanelles. Again, this is the Fontanelles at the Poverty Board, trying to get assistance, 9 kids and a husband and wife with all kinds of difficulties. And again, it allowed readers to be a witness to some of the things this family was absolutely experiencing on a daily basis. So again, I just don't think we have something like that that allows you to plunge in. What Parks has done here, again, Life called him a visual ambassador to hidden worlds of poor and marginalized and oppressed. And what he does here, I think, is, again, very, very intentional, where he is behind the man at the Poverty Board, the administrator, looking at the faces of the exhausted and just completely discouraged mother and the exhausted and worried children. But we are behind the desk, being the ones who are being appealed to for assistance. Next image, please. Another big project, and actually this was earlier, this is Birmingham, and he actually followed a family in Birmingham to capture something of their life in the segregated their home, and Life magazine had to help to resettle the family who had become the focus of that photo essay. Next image, please. I think what's fascinating about Parks is he's allowed to go certain places and see certain things. This is just called Tenement Couple. You get an immediate sense of the heat and the frustration and the claustrophobia of this small, hot tenement apartment in New York City. But again, he's able to go into certain worlds and capture things that other photographers were not. The trust of the sitters, and again, something of their lives. And I just encourage you, if you don't know Gordon Parks, the books are just fascinating too, particularly Learning Tree about his early years in Kansas, and his memoir that talks again about the move to DC and Ella Watson, called Choice of Weapons. Next image, please. Next photographer is Charles Moore. And I am guessing many of you have never heard of Charles Moore, but I can guarantee you have seen his work. He is a native Southerner and obviously a white man. He worked first for the Montgomery newspaper, later for Life magazine. And it's really his photographs of the civil rights movement that I think that we all perhaps remember and have a sense of. So his work is highly influential in what the world saw in terms of nonviolent protests and the police and the fire department's response. If you got to remember that more than half, at the time of his work, half of the adult influential, and the photographs that appeared on those pages could really change things, could change minds, could change culture, and could change legislation as well. Next image, please. Birmingham, city in the South, and one writer said it was the last stop before Johannesburg. And of course, here, Martin Luther King had placed much of his focus on Birmingham, and nonviolent protesters in Birmingham were met with, again, the police and the fire department. And this is what Moore captures. Again, that horrific stream, the firefighters had actually channeled multiple hoses together. So what they were getting was something like 100 pounds per square inch of pressure with these hoses. And the way he captures this, that it actually looks almost like an arrow, just piercing the back of the man on the right side of the image. He got so close, I'm going to ask for the next slide, please, that he was actually able to hear the firemen talking to each other. One would later say to him, "We're supposed to fight fire, not people." And what's interesting, again, as a white Southern man, he had access to certain areas that another photographer would not. So in a sense, he puts himself right behind the firefighters who are attacking the protesters, the nonviolent protesters. And in a sense, we are right behind them, which is really interesting. But again, because of who he was able to get certain images that, again, completely changed the national conversation. Next image, please. This is the next one. I'm guessing everybody knows this very well too. Some of these are quite well-known images. If you look at his body of work, and there's a wonderful YouTube documentary about Charles Moore that you can pull up. Many of the others aren't as familiar, but you see, again, a protester being attacked by a police dog and his pants being ripped. And again, many of these are used later by other artists like Andy Warhol, who take this, put it in a silk screen and repeat the image over and over again. But the original work is that of Charles Moore. Next image, please. This is Martin Luther King being arrested. And this was a series where he's running after King, where he's a series of 4 or 5, where first the police grab him on the street, and then they hustle him into the station. And again, what is so powerful about this is, again, because he is a white Southern man, he is able to put himself in a certain position. He says in the documentary that he actually just scooted through the little wooden swinging door in the police department. And he obviously did. He just went behind. So he is there, right behind this booking officer. So we get a whole nother perspective, again, as a viewer of what is going on in the experience of the arrest here of Martin Luther King. And one more photographer that I want to share with you today, next image please, is a French photographer named J.R. He originally was a graffiti artist turned photographer. His work is always outside. He wants, in his words, to be in the street. he said that is the largest art gallery in the world and it's accessible to all. He also focuses on not just social justice issues, but very much places of conflict, marginalized and oppressed groups as well. The next image, please. One of his biggest projects was in 2007. He visited Israel and Palestine and created, as he says, the largest illegal photo show ever. He traveled extensively on both sides of the wall and said he saw so many connections and similarities. He said, we need to put people face to face. So this project is just called Face to Face. He asked people on both sides. He asked Jews and Muslims and Christians on both sides to make a silly face. He talked to clergy people and hairdressers and teachers, bakers, and you name it. And people made these faces. And again, he installed them on both sides of the wall. He said, we have to be able to look at each other because that is where everything has to begin, and see each other's faces. And I thought, fascinating piece. Next image, please, is image he worked with inmates at a California prison. And again, hearing their stories, capturing their portraits. He talked about the fact this is on the very top. This is the roof of the prison. Talked about the fact that, again, with so many incarcerated people, we do not see them and we do not have contact. And he said, I want you to see the faces. So this is an aerial view of incarcerated people in that prison in California. Again, looking up. Next image is along the southern border wall. This is a piece he did called Coquito. And his idea was to do something, and this is the images on the Mexican side of the border wall. He had an image and he wanted to get a family to cooperate with him. He met a family on the Mexican side who said they would be willing to help, and he met their toddler. And this is a photograph of the toddler. And he created this huge scaffolding, again, Mexican side, and this large photograph. He wanted to, again, make us see each other. And this idea too of this toddler peering over this massive border wall, which in this case looks also a little bit like a crib, with just curiosity, no judgment, no fear, but simply curiosity about others. The mother of the toddler said of this project that the artist was trying to give voice to the silent. And she added something that I think is absolutely true and true of every photographer we looked at today. No one looks until he makes it big. And I should add, I think no one looks until a photographer captures something that we need to see, that we need to pay attention to, and that needs to change our thinking on big topics. So I thank you today for coming, and I thank Zach for his valiant efforts with our challenges in our internet today, but I think it worked. I hope that you all saw the images, and I hope that you could hear me as well. And I think we can stop the screen share. Thank you, Zach, for heroic efforts there. If anybody has a question, I think we can get out of the screen share now. If anybody has a question that they want to bring up, delighted to try to answer. I hope, are these new photographers to folks? Anybody have somebody they'd never heard of before?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Almost
good.
all of them.
Oh, good. And again, these are, if you have time, the YouTube documentary about Charles Moore is fabulous and fascinating about his coverage of the civil rights movement. And again, if you have time, Gordon Parks' work never ends. And his books, again, explaining exactly how he went about capturing Ella Watson and his he didn't try. Just a fascinating, again, self-taught artist who was not afraid to try any form of art and excelled in them, all of them. Any questions you might have?
What would you say is the medium that we now see is gone? And there's a lot of social media, but is there, what's the,
Because I keep thinking, everybody has their thing they look at, right? If it's this station or that, I don't know, so papers and on the internet, but to me, it's one image. And what's fascinating about Life magazine is they said to somebody, you go and spend 2 or 3 weeks with that family or that person or in that city, and then create this body of work. And to me, and of course, you didn't have all of the many, many different media outlets in the 40s, 50s, 60s that we do today. But the idea that half of the country, half of the adults in the United States would have opened that magazine and said, oh my gosh, there's 16 pages about this family in Birmingham, or this, that to me is really interesting, because you're right. We all have these fragmented things we've seen now, but there isn't that national piece of, we are all looking at this together. And I don't think there's any, you might see an image in Time or, or the New York Times, but it's not the same, I think, as the in-depth photo essay,
Well,
is my thought.
I think that television does quite a bit, because you're seeing the same image over and over again.
Yeah.
And everybody's watching it at the same time.
Right. That's unifying, but what's interesting is it's not the depth of saying,
you can't examine it for a long time.
Right, right. And it's interesting. Charles Moore, again, in this documentary, talks again about just spending time with people and what that was like to really spend time.
But I kind of think that we used to have newsreels at the movies, and that was quite impressive because it was so big, and you could see what's happening in the news. And now we see it at the same actually happening while we were watching it.
what's so
Please
striking is
these photos now. Does the Library of Congress have an archive that we can access?
Yep.
Or?
I would, that's a great question. You Google Time Life, of course, many of these are in their archive. So yeah, so if you do that and look for photograph site, and Library of Congress, of course, has a huge archive. And most of the photographers we looked at today, there's Lewis, are all in the collections of the Johnson. Some of the others are probably in the collection of the Kroc Library, like Jacob Reese. And then JR, those are just on site specific. So they're on a building, or they're, it's not something that's in a museum's collection. They're so about being outdoors and seeing this work. So it's nothing that kind of fits, believe it or not, in a museum.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I've got a question about the photography collection up at the Johnson. Are they just the prints, the pictures themselves, or are they usually a print and a negative, or just the negative? How are they curated?
It's usually, that's a great question, Zach. It's usually a print. I think it's pretty rare to have the negative too. The museum just like 2-3 years ago got its first curator of photography, who we share with the Kroc. So I think we're in a whole different world of learning about the collection and buying more to add to it. But my understanding is it's usually just the print and not a negative that accompanies it.
Are these exhibits generally available, or do you have to wait till there's a particular show?
You pretty much have to wait. So a couple years ago, there was a big Margaret Bourke-White show at the museum. So it pretty much depends on what the curator is putting together.
Is there a way to search through the collection, like to
Yeah.
know what's in the?
There is. It's not what you call easy to navigate, but if you go to the Johnson website, there's a bar that says search the collection and it says e-museum. So you would put in an artist's name or a topic. I will admit to you honestly, it's not the easiest thing to search, but yes, it exists. It definitely exists. But I would think, gosh, as I say, for things like this, Time Life would be a really good one to look at, or as Priscilla said, Library of Congress would be good. Kroc Library also has thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs, and I think they have a searchable database as well.
Are they continuing to
there is-
digitize them?
I think that they are, but I don't know. As I say, this is a big deal to finally have somebody shared between the Kroc and the Giles. Had somebody helping her, and the sheer volume, I can't remember how many photos the Johnson has, but it's just huge volume when you look at the Kroc. So I think she's slowly making her way through. She's done several shows at the Johnson and also at the Kroc. So I'm sure she will do many more once we get back into the real world.
What is the Kroc?
The Kroc, what is it called? Housed in Olin Library. Can
It's the old manuscripts, photographs. I mean, it's sort of old anything.
I don't know how to explain it, but you go into Olin and you go down several flights, and they have an underground, very nice gallery. So they always have shows, usually 2 or 3 a year with things in their collection. So, but as I say, it's a well-kept secret, but it's a wonderful place, and it is housed within the big
I think-
Olin Library.
The difference between how we see images now on purpose, the back images, whereas nowadays, for maybe 20 years, we have seen the same image over and over and over again with no background of the people in the image.
Mhm.
So it's the absolute reverse.
Yeah.
And the way we show our images is also the reverse. I mean, the values behind them now are mostly maybe to sell advertising on television or whatever. Mostly, this is what happened here with no understanding, no background. Whereas before, Life magazine looked and asked the photographers to do that. So just a totally opposite.
I think that's a really good point. And it's interesting, again, I would commend that Charles Moore documentary to you, because again, he was sent to places, he talks about going to cover in depth the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
And, and again, so he was there for quite some time, taking photographs of all the different, the initiation ceremony or the potluck or the march, all of these things. And today, you're right, if there was an equivalent, you could imagine, although it would be, I'm sure that was very dangerous, and today would be too, if Life magazine said to a photographer, you're going to go out and, cover that militia group in the 50s and very dangerous today too. But you've got that sense of, we're really going to follow this group, this person for this length of time and get more than one shot.
TV supplanted photojournalism.
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And when you think about it, life ends, does anybody know? So life starts in 36, right? And then, so 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, but I don't know, does life finally end in maybe the 80s? And Look, remember Look magazine also,
Yeah.
but I just don't think there's anything, again, comparable. And there may be some websites where a photographer really goes deep and allows you to accompany them, but not the same thing as here. I would have said it's on the coffee table where an entire family is saying, yep, we're going to. So, and there's nothing, I mean, again, that 50% of the adults would have been reading that every week. That's quite amazing.
And things are really organized by point of view. And so if we tend to just look at either on the media or in print, images that reinforce our point of view, we don't see the rest of the story.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
a good point.
it's sort of like there's all these parallel universes going on.
Yeah.
And we're not really informed.
Mm-hmm.
There's
And
something
that's a
difficult
good
to
point,
look at.
Melissa. And it'd be interesting to study when you think about, again, Life magazine. That was Henry Luce as the publisher's point of view too, where that's interesting too, that the power of him saying, let's cover this is an interesting idea too. When you've got the head of a media empire, I mean, considering he was Time and Life and Fortune, that's an intriguing study too.
Well, I can't help but bring up the very disturbing images from the insurrection.
Mhm.
And part of me is fascinated to look at it, and part of me doesn't want to see it at all. Seeing that dialectic in myself, it's just really striking.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I agree, Melissa. And part of you can't stop looking, and part of me never wants to forget those. And then, yeah, many, many different feelings.
Yeah.
I have a question. In the collection at the Johnson Museum, are there Dorothea Lange photos?
Yes.
Because you didn't mention her, and that's the only American photographer whose name I know.
Yes, there are
Is
Dorothea
James
Lange.
Dixon, as you're talking about, I think.
And I tend to, she is a great photographer, and Migrant Mother is such a familiar image to many people. And there are Dorothea Langes in the collection. I guess I thought she's someone that, again, people probably, if they've seen one, they probably maybe. And one of her most famous pieces in the Johnson is, I think it's called Old Slave with a Long Memory. So there are several of her works.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you for coming. It's just always a pleasure to get to see you all and be able to talk about these issues. I appreciate it. And thank you, Zach. I know this one was a little more complicated, but our shuttle took off.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Carol. We appreciate it. And thanks for hanging through the tech difficulties and the internet instability, but great to see you all. I'll post this
Thank you very
on
much, Jack.
Facebook if you want, and have a great weekend.
All right.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I
Thank
know.
you.
Good to see everyone.
Yes. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Oh.
Oh, yes. Okay.